In 2008, Barack Obama told this really incredible story about a woman named Ann Nixon Cooper.
Oh, right, the 106-year-old voter.
Exactly. She was 106 years old. And when she was born, she literally couldn't vote because of, two fundamental realities of American law at the time. First, she was a woman, and second, she was black.
Yeah, which is just wild to think about in that time frame.
It really is.
Yeah.
And yet, by the time she was 106, she was casting a ballot for the first black president in the nation's history. And, that isn't just some touching campaign story designed to get a round of applause.
Right. It's a lot deeper than that.
Yeah, it's the literal mathematical reshaping of American identity. So, welcome to the deep dive. If you are looking for a smart, time-respecting shortcut to being well-informed, you are absolutely in the right place.
Thanks for having me. Today we're looking at Carl Pedersen's book. It's called Obama's America, and it was published back in 2009.
So, a real snapshot of that specific era.
Exactly. We're capturing the raw aftermath of an election that really redefined the political landscape.
Okay, let's unpack this, because our mission today is to explore how the 2008 election was, so much more than a standard political horse race.
Yeah.
Pedersen frames it as this fundamental clash over who gets to define the American experience.
Right, and it's about a complete revolution in grassroots organizing, too.
And a massive pivot point for the nation's role on the global stage.
But before we go any further, just a quick heads up for you listening. Pedersen's book deals with some incredibly raw, politically charged history from both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, it gets pretty intense.
It does. We are going to be unpacking debates over socialism, immigration, the Iraq War, and some very intense political smears. And our job today isn't to play referee or, pick a winner.
Right. We're definitely not taking sides here.
Exactly. We're strictly here to map out the historical arguments contained in the author's work, exploring how these specific narratives shifted the country.
We are just looking at the mechanics of the arguments, right? Exploring how they function in real time. So let's start with the demographics of identity. The 2008 election was essentially a collision between the quote-unquote real America and the new America.
You can see this so vividly in just the geographical backgrounds of the two tickets.
Oh, totally. The Republican narrative was heavily anchored by Sarah Palin and her hometown of Wasilla, Alaska.
Yeah, and Pedersen compares this directly to Frederick Jackson Turner's 19th century frontier thesis.
The idea that American democracy was forged by, rugged individualism on the edge of the wilderness.
Right, exactly. Wasilla was essentially the 21st century proxy for that nostalgia. I mean, it was a small town, it was remote, and it was overwhelmingly white.
And you contrast that with Barack Obama's background. You have Hawaii, which is this island archipelago in the Pacific, and Chicago, this massive, sprawling industrial metropolis.
Hawaii is actually crucial here because it was already what the Census Bureau projects the rest of the U.S. will become by mid-century.
Which is a majority-minority population.
Right, which totally upends the historical baseline. Because for centuries, the default definition of an American was based on J. Hector St. John de Criver's 18th century writings.
Yeah, he described the American as this strange mixture of blood.
But he was talking specifically about a European mixture.
What's fascinating here is how the definition of that mixture expanding beyond Europe triggered intense political friction.
Like really intense.
Yeah, the McCain-Palin campaign utilized identity politics to frame Obama as the ultimate stranger. And this wasn't just subtle messaging.
No, it was very overt. You saw it in the deliberate spread of rumors that he attended madrasas, those Islamic religious schools, which they used as a smear to paint him as a foreign threat.
And you saw it in the infamous New Yorker cover caricaturing him in Muslim garb.
Oh, yeah. And those celeb television ads. They tried to define him as this cosmopolitan elite who was entirely disconnected from the struggles of everyday people.
But rather than run from his complex background, Obama leaned all the way into it. He positioned himself as a rooted cosmopolitan, right? He took his biracial global upbringing and framed it as the most quintessentially American story possible. That's actually why he told that Ann Nixon Cooper story.
To illustrate that the arc of history bends toward inclusion, Pedersen uses a concept from the economist Amartya Sen to explain this dynamic.
Oh, the idea of competing identities.
Yes. Sen writes about the danger of competing identities, arguing that extreme division happens when we miniaturize people.
Miniaturize them, like force them into a box.
Exactly. When you force complex human beings into a single rigid box based on one trait, the 2008 election marked a transition away from an Anglo-Protestant core culture toward what the book calls a tempered multiculturalism.
And Obama really embodied that refusal to be miniaturized. Let me throw an analogy at you to test this idea.
Sure, go for it.
Think about this demographic shift, like a massive computer network. Is it like a country holding on to an old operating system while the physical hardware of its demographics has already been upgraded?
Oh, that's interesting.
Like, the people running the old OS aren't obsolete, but the system they rely on can no longer run the entire machine. And they resent being forced to learn a new interface they didn't ask for.
That captures the friction perfectly, honestly. The hardware of the country fundamentally changed. By 2008, roughly 84% of Americans lived in metropolitan areas.
Wow. 84%.
Yeah. So the anxiety from the small town demographic wasn't just economic. It was the realization that their operating system was no longer the default setting for the nation.
But here's the thing about a demographic shift. It doesn't automatically vote.
Right. It's just potential.
Yeah, a shifting population is just latent energy until somebody builds an engine to harness it. And figuring out how to actually mobilize this new hardware requires a completely different set of tools.
It requires returning to the streets. If you look at Obama's history as a community organizer in Chicago in the 1980s, you see the blueprint.
Yeah. Pedersen highlights the really transformative moment when Obama was organizing the residents of Old Guild Gardens, that notoriously neglected public housing project.
Right, where the residents were dealing with asbestos in their buildings.
And Obama's initial instinct was to just petition the local officials, assuming the system would rationally fix the problem once it was pointed out.
Which is what a lot of people would assume.
Exactly. But through this grueling, deeply frustrating process of being ignored by the bureaucracy, he learned a vital lesson. Top-down politics rarely saves the people at the bottom. Power has to be aggregated and leveraged from the ground up.
This is where the profound influence of Saul Alinsky enters the picture. Alinsky was a legendary Chicago organizer who preached that you have to communicate with people strictly in terms of their own lived experiences.
Right. You don't hand a marginalized voter a 50-page white paper on environmental policy.
No, you talk to them about the asbestos in their living room.
Yeah.
You connect the macro policy to the micro reality.
And the genius of the 2008 campaign was taking that gritty, face-to-face Alinsky method and supercharging it with Web 2.0 technology.
They took Howard Dean's 50-state strategy.
The philosophy that you can test every single zip code, relying on small-dollar internet donations.
Yes, and they fused it with Karl Rove's pioneering use of consumer data for micro-targeting. They built myBarackObama.com to let volunteers organize themselves.
The contrast with Hillary Clinton's primary campaign really reveals exactly how revolutionary this was, because the Clinton campaign relied on a highly top-down strategy, driven by Mark Penn's theory of microtrends.
Penn's strategy was to slice the electorate into tiny demographic slivers and hit them with highly produced, targeted television ads.
Heavily focusing on the big Super Tuesday states, it was very much broadcast politics.
Meanwhile, Obama's team was holding Camp Obamas.
Yeah, these intensive training sessions.
Led by veteran organizers like Marshall Gans, who had previously worked with the United Farm Workers. Gans didn't just teach volunteers how to hand out flyers.
Right. He taught them how to articulate their story of self. He trained them to look a skeptical neighbor in the eye and say, here is my personal story, here is my struggle, and here's why I'm asking you to join me.
Now, any mobilization of this scale is going to generate intense pushback. Pedersen objectively documents the controversy surrounding ACORN.
The Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now.
Right. ACORN was running aggressive, street-level voter registration drives in predominantly low-income neighborhoods.
And the sheer volume of these registrations, along with instances of sloppy or falsified forms submitted by temporary workers, it became a massive flashpoint.
For Republicans, ACORN symbolized the anxiety that this new mobilization was fundamentally corrupting the electoral process.
It was the flashpoint for a much deeper historical tension.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the grassroots machinery of 2008 is the direct descendant of the civil rights movement. Pedersen traces a straight line from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and their dangerous voter registration drives in the Jim Crow South in 1961.
Right, leading to the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act.
Straight through to Obama's Project Vote efforts in Chicago in 1992. It demonstrates a symbiotic relationship. Agitation in the streets eventually forces legislative power in the halls of government.
But let me stop you there, because that raises an inevitable contradiction.
Okay, what's that?
Once a grassroots insurgency actually wins the White House, can it survive? I mean, once you control the nuclear codes and the federal bureaucracy, you are the establishment. Doesn't a bottom-up movement inherently die the moment it becomes a top-down administration?
That is the exact paradox Pedersen wrestles with. After the election, the campaign apparatus morphed into organizing for America, ostensibly to keep that volunteer army engaged to pressure Congress.
But governing is entirely different from campaigning.
Exactly. Governing requires ugly compromises and dealing with entrenched corporate interests. The transition from a nimble insurgency to the sluggish reality of the executive branch is incredibly jarring for the base.
Especially when that base expects immediate structural change. Because the morning after the election, this newly organized demographic didn't just inherit the White House, they inherited a collapsing global economy.
The 2008 financial crisis.
Yeah, it triggered a fierce, highly ideological battle over the role of the U.S. government, sparking what conservatives explicitly warned was the Europeanization of America.
To understand the conservative panic, you have to look at what Europeanization actually means in this context.
Right. Figures like Mitt Romney weren't just criticizing tax rates.
No, they were arguing that Obama's policies would completely replace American free enterprise with a European-style social democracy. They believed government intervention would smother the Protestant work ethic and create a permanent welfare state.
But liberals viewed the exact same economic wreckage and saw a once-in-a-generation opportunity. They saw a chance for a new deal.
Yeah, Pedersen draws direct comparisons between Obama's first 100 days and Franklin D. Roosevelt's aggressive interventions during the Great Depression.
And Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society programs that wanted the government to step in as the ultimate economic shock absorber.
You see this play out in the specific policies Pedersen highlights. The massive $787 billion stimulus bill wasn't just designed to stabilize banks. It included unprecedented investments in green energy, infrastructure, and an expansion of food stamps.
And you had the expansion of ST, the State Children's Health Insurance Program, which targeted families who earned too much for Medicaid but couldn't afford private insurance.
And then there was the absolute brawl over labor rights, specifically the Employee Free Choice Act, or EFCA.
Which was heavily backed by powerful unions like the SEIU. And the mechanism of EFCA is crucial to understand here.
Right, the card check provision.
Yeah, instead of a long, drawn-out secret ballot process where companies have weeks to run anti-union campaigns, EFCA would allow unions to form simply if a majority of workers signed a card.
Business groups were terrified, arguing this would instantly tilt power to union bosses and completely Europeanize the American workplace.
Which is why the stakes were so high. U.S. labor unions had peaked in power in the 1950s and were absolutely battered by the deregulation and globalization of the Reagan era in the 1980s.
With Obama's election and his appointment of Hilda Solis as Secretary of Labor, the labor movement believed they finally had a champion to reverse a 30-year decline.
Let's visualize this domestic struggle. Think of the U.S. economy as a massive cargo ship. For 30 years, the internal steering mechanism, the actual hydraulic machinery of the state, was locked hard to the right.
Heavily favoring trickle-down economics and corporate deregulation.
Exactly. So the 2008 election wasn't just a polite changing of the captain. The new progressive coalition essentially stormed the bridge and tried to violently yank that locked steering column back to the left, all while the ship was actively taking on water from the financial crisis.
And yanking a steering column that aggressively creates massive institutional turbulence. Political scientists cited by Pedersen, like John Judas and Rui Teixeira, viewed this turbulence as an epochal shift.
The end of an era.
Yes. They theorized we were witnessing the end of Nixonland, the era of conservative dominance built on the Southern strategy, which appealed to white voters in the South by playing on racial anxieties. They believed 2008 signaled the permanent rise of a new progressive coalition.
But this profound domestic shift wasn't happening in a vacuum. How a nation organizes itself internally directly dictates how it projects power externally. Which brings us to the global stage.
Pedersen argues that 2008 marked the shift into the post-American century and the dawn of the Obama Doctrine.
And to grasp the Obama Doctrine, we have to establish what it was actively dismantling, right? The Bush Doctrine.
Right. The Bush Doctrine was largely defined by preemptive action and unilateralism. If the U.S. perceives a threat, it strikes first, alone if necessary.
And Pedersen traces the foundational logic of this back to a 1992 Defense Planning Guidance document. It essentially stated that following the Cold War, the U.S. must actively prevent any rival nation from even dreaming of matching American military power.
The Obama Doctrine was a sharp rejection of that unipolar mindset. It emphasized what Pedersen terms dignity promotion.
Dignity promotion.
Yeah.
So the philosophy there is that you cannot guarantee long-term American security simply by dropping bombs on adversaries.
Exactly. You have to improve the social and economic conditions that breed extremism in the first place. It relies heavily on multilateralism, diplomacy, and sharing the geopolitical burden with allies.
And the seed of this doctrine was planted back in 2002. When Obama was just a state senator, he gave a speech against the impending invasion of Iraq.
But he didn't take a pacifist stance against all wars.
No, he explicitly said he was against dumb wars. He rejected conflicts driven by ideological zeal rather than clear, immediate necessity.
That shift in military philosophy was a pragmatic response to shifting global realities. Pedersen cites a National Intelligence Council report projecting the end of what it called the short American century.
The short American century. That is an incredibly evocative phrase.
It refers to the period from roughly 1893 to 1989. This era culminated in a brief unipolar moment right after the fall of the Soviet Union, where the U.S. had absolutely zero geopolitical rivals.
But the intelligence report warned that this moment was over, and we were rapidly moving into a post-American century.
Driven largely by the rise of the BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India.
And especially the economic explosion of China, the center of geopolitical gravity was shifting eastward.
And Pedersen argues that Obama's unique biography made him uniquely equipped to navigate this. He spent part of his childhood in Indonesia. He grew up in Hawaii. He has Kenyan heritage.
He physically and intellectually embodied a departure from the traditional Eurocentric East Coast foreign policy establishment.
Pedersen includes a brilliant quote from Fareed Zakaria, who argues there is immense strategic value in knowing what it means not to be an American.
Not to be an American.
Yeah, it provides the strategic empathy required to understand how American power is perceived by the rest of the world.
But let's pause on that phrase, the post-American century. Is that too pessimistic? It sounds like a declaration of collapse. Let me offer a different way to look at it.
Okay, let's hear it.
Think of global power, like the tech industry. For a long time, the U.S. operated like early Apple Phenuge. We were a closed, proprietary ecosystem where we dictated the hardware, the software, and the app store.
Right.
Moving into a multipolar world is like suddenly having to compete in an open-source Android market. It's not that the U.S. stops making the most powerful phones, it's just that we no longer exclusively own the underlying operating system that the rest of the world is using to build their own economies.
That is an incredibly precise way to frame it. Zakaria himself clarifies that the post-American century isn't about the terminal decline of America. It's about the rise of everyone else.
The rise of everyone else.
We are entering a non-polar world. Power isn't monopolized by one or two superpowers anymore. It is fractured and shared among rising nation-states, massive multinational corporations, and non-state actors.
And navigating an open-source geopolitical market requires negotiation, not just dictation, which really brings us full circle back to identity.
How so?
Well, you cannot negotiate effectively with someone if you don't fundamentally understand who they are and where they come from. So let's map out the journey we've just taken through Pedersen's work. We started by examining the changing face of the American voter.
That profound demographic hardware upgrade from a European frontier ideal to a metropolitan multicultural reality.
We look at how that latent energy was captured by fusing old-school Linsky Street organizing with the micro-targeting of Web 2.0.
Then we analyzed the intense institutional turbulence that occurred when that new progressive coalition took the wheel and attempted to forge a new Deal.
Sparking fierce conservative resistance against the Europeanization of the economy. And finally, we zoomed out to see how that domestic evolution mirrored a sprawling, complex shift on the global stage.
Moving from the preemptive strikes of the unipolar Bush era to the pragmatic, open-source diplomacy required in a post-American world.
For you listening, why does dissecting this specific history from 2008 matter so much today? It matters because understanding the mechanics of these shifts provides the exact roadmap for where global politics, labor rights, and international relations are colliding right now. The demographic hardware is still upgrading.
The massive cargo ship of the economy is still being fought over.
Exactly. The fault lines Pedersen mapped out over a decade ago didn't resolve themselves. They are the exact same tectonic plates we are standing on today, which leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day.
Okay, what is it?
If national identity is as fluid, overlapping, and deeply interconnected as this deep dive suggests, how will the very next generation of leaders redefine what it means to be a citizen?
Wow.
I'm talking about a generation that has grown up entirely within a digital, borderless, non-polar world. What happens to our political systems when the old, rigid boundaries of small town versus city or east versus west don't just evolve, but completely dissolve into the digital ether?
It forces us to ask what core values hold a society together when the traditional borders of identity no longer apply.
Exactly. We started this conversation by talking about the math of a demographic spreadsheet. Maybe the ultimate realization here isn't that the numbers are shifting. Maybe the reality is that the spreadsheet itself can no longer capture the sheer, messy complexity of the human data we're trying to input. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep questioning the mechanics of the narratives around you, and we will catch you next time.